Captain Eric Donovan stood on the balcony of the human colony's outpost, his eyes scanning the horizon of the harsh, barren landscape. The planet, once home to a thriving human settlement, was now a place of isolation. Most of the population had moved to safer colonies, leaving only a few soldiers behind to maintain the peace. Eric had grown used to the silence. The only sounds that reached him were the occasional hum of machinery or the distant whistling of the wind. But today, something was different. A small, battered transport ship had landed outside the perimeter, its hull scorched from what looked like a rough journey. Eric's hand rested on the hilt of his sidearm as he stepped down from the balcony. He had heard the whispers earlier. There were refugees, alien ones, looking for shelter. A mother and her daughter. The war had ravaged their world, and now they had nowhere to go. As he walked toward the ship, Eric couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. He had been in battles, witnessed horrors, but this was different. Refugees, fleeing for their lives, were never easy to deal with. The last thing Eric wanted was to be caught in the middle of a political mess. When he reached the ship, the ramp was down, and the two figures stood in the shadow of the craft. The mother was tall, her skin a pale shade of blue, her face sharp and angular. She looked like a warrior, her eyes fierce but tired. Her daughter, much younger, appeared fragile. Her large, wide eyes held a mix of curiosity and fear. "Captain Donovan?" The mother's voice was low, almost hesitant. "Yes," Eric replied, his hand still resting on his sidearm. "You're the refugees?" The woman nodded. "I am Lyra, and this is my daughter Zira." She stepped forward, then paused, as if unsure of what to say next. Eric studied them carefully. There was no hostility in their posture, no sign of aggression. He had heard stories of the aliens from the war, many species that had been enemies of humanity. But he had never imagined he'd be standing here facing them in such a strange, vulnerable position. "Why are you here?" Eric asked, his voice firm but not unkind. He had been trained for difficult situations, but this was something different. Refugees didn't usually approach humans this far out in the galaxy. Lyra's eyes dropped to the ground, her expression softening as she spoke. "We have no choice. Our world is gone. My people, our planet. Everything is lost. We only seek refuge. Please, Captain, we mean no harm." Eric felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't trust easily, especially after everything humanity had been through. But there was something about Lyra's voice that made him hesitate. She was a warrior. There was a story behind those eyes, a history of pain and loss that Eric could almost feel. "Do you have any weapons?" Eric asked, narrowing. His eyes, Lyra's gaze, met his. She didn't flinch. "No. All we have left is what we carry. Food, clothing. Nothing more." Eric studied them both. The daughter, Zira, clung to her mother's side, her small hand wrapped around Lyra's arm. She looked up at Eric with innocent eyes, and for a moment, the hardness in Lyra's features softened. There was no doubt in Eric's mind. This was a mother desperate to protect her child. He had seen it many times before. "All right," Eric said after a long pause. He nodded toward the small shelter in the distance. "Come with me. I'll get you some food and supplies. You'll be safe for now, but I can't promise anything beyond that. There are still some humans here who might not take kindly to having aliens around." Lyra nodded, but didn't speak. She seemed to know this was the only option available. She stepped forward, taking Zira's hand and leading her toward the shelter. Eric followed them, his mind racing. This wasn't what he had expected when he signed up for the military. His job was to protect humanity, not get involved in alien politics. Once they reached the shelter, Eric opened the door and stepped aside to let them enter. The inside was simple, nothing more than a few beds, a table, and some basic supplies. A small stove hummed in the corner, and the faint smell of cooking lingered in the air. Lyra and Zira sat down, their eyes scanning the small space. It was clear they were used to more luxurious accommodations, but they made no complaint. Eric could see the exhaustion in Lyra's face. She had been through a lot. Her people, her planet. Everything had been lost in the war. But she wasn't asking for sympathy. "What do you need?" Eric asked, breaking the silence. Lyra met his gaze, her voice low and steady. "Just food. My daughter is hungry." Eric went to the small supply closet and retrieved a package of dried food. He handed it to Lyra, who took it with trembling hands. Her eyes flickered between him and the package. Then she looked down at Zira. "I'll cook," Lyra said quietly. "I can make something, if you have a stove." Eric nodded. "Of course, I'll leave you to it. If you need anything else, just let me know." He turned to leave, but Lyra's voice stopped him. "Captain?" Eric turned back. "Yes?" She hesitated before speaking, her voice softer now. I know it's strange. I know we are not welcome here. But I ask this one thing. Please, feed my daughter. I will stay quiet. I will cook. I will stay in your bed if you wish. Just feed her." The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Eric could see the pride in Lyra, but there was also a deep, desperate plea for help. She was a mother, not a warrior in that moment. She was just a woman, pleading for her daughter's survival. Eric didn't know how to respond. He had no experience with this kind of situation. But the desperation in Lyra's eyes made something shift within him. "Of course," he said quietly. "We'll take care of you. All of you." As he turned and left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something far bigger than just providing shelter, something that could change everything, for better or for worse. Eric stood outside the shelter, his mind racing. The small moment of kindness he had offered had felt right, but now, as he paced in front of the shelter, uncertainty crept in. Refugees weren't something humans dealt with often, especially those from other races. The war had taught humanity many lessons, some of them painful. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. But there was something about Lyra, the way she held herself, the quiet strength in her eyes, that made Eric wonder. He was no stranger to military operations, to the harsh realities of battle. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone. This was a mother and daughter in need, and he couldn't help but want to protect them. Inside the shelter, Lyra set to work preparing the food. The smell of cooking filled the air, a welcome change from the sterile, lifeless scent of the outpost. Eric watched her from the doorway, unsure of what to do next. She had already begun to unpack the small supply of dried food he had given her, working quickly and efficiently. Her movements were fluid, practiced, even if the exhaustion was evident in the lines of her face. Zira, the young girl, sat on the small bed in the corner, watching her mother with wide eyes. She was quiet, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed the activity around her. There was a softness to her, a gentleness that was hard to miss, especially in such a harsh world. Lyra glanced up, noticing Eric standing at the doorway. Her expression softened, though only slightly. "You don't have to stay. I can handle this." Eric hesitated. "I'm not leaving you alone," he said firmly. "If you need anything, I'll be here." Lyra nodded, though she said nothing in reply. Instead, she returned to her work, chopping dried vegetables with precision. It was clear she was trying to keep herself busy, trying to keep the thoughts of her ruined world from consuming her. As she worked, Eric felt a strange sense of helplessness. He had seen soldiers suffer. He had seen people broken by war. But this was different. There was no fighting here, no enemies to face. The battle Lyra and Zira fought was one of survival, of simple human need. "Do you have family?" Eric asked, trying to break the silence. Lyra's knife paused in midair, and for a moment Eric thought she might not answer. But then she spoke, her voice low. My people, my family, they are gone. The words hit Eric harder than he expected. He had known about the alien conflict, of course, but hearing it from her, seeing the weight of loss in her eyes, made it real. It was not just a distant war. It was a tragedy that affected lives, families, entire civilizations. Lyra didn't speak further, and Eric didn't press. He could see she was struggling to hold herself together. Instead, he stepped closer, moving to the small table and sitting down. I'm sorry, Eric said quietly. Lyra gave a small shake of her head. You don't have to be sorry. This isn't your fault. They fell into silence again, with only the soft sound of Lyra's movements as she continued to cook. Eric watched her for a while, studying her. Despite her calm demeanor, he could sense her strength, her determination. But there was a vulnerability there, too, hidden beneath layers of pride and duty. He couldn't help but wonder how much of that strength was forced, how much of it was her only way of coping with the pain. Eventually, the food was ready. Lyra set the plates down on the table, the simple meal looking far more appetizing than anything Eric had eaten in weeks. There were no fancy spices or intricate dishes, just the basic sustenance of survival. Still, it was comforting in its simplicity. Zira stood up and walked over to the table, her small hands reaching for the food. Her mother smiled softly at her, then looked over at Eric. Please, eat, Lyra said, her voice no longer as cold as it had been when they first met. You've been kind to us, and for that, I thank you. Eric nodded, taking a seat at the table. He hesitated for only a moment before he took a bite of the food. It was warm, comforting, exactly what he needed. And as he ate, he couldn't help but notice how Lyra watched him. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of gratitude, and something else, something more complicated. So, what now? Eric asked, looking at her after a few minutes of silence. What happens next? Lyra didn't look up from her plate, but her voice was steady. We wait. There's nothing else to do. My people, they're far from here, scattered across the galaxy. I don't know if they will come for us, but we can't stay in hiding forever. Eric frowned. And what will you do if they don't? Lyra's gaze met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I don't know. We survive. That's all I can promise. Eric nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had seen people pushed to their limits, and he knew that survival was the only thing that mattered once everything else was stripped away. But that didn't mean it was easy. Zira, who had been eating quietly, looked up at Lyra with concern in her eyes. Mama, what if they don't come? Lyra reached out and gently placed a hand on her daughter's head, offering her a reassuring smile. They will come, Zira. They will come. But even Eric could see the doubt behind her words. It was the same doubt that lingered in his own heart. How many times had humanity told themselves the same thing, only to find the world changed in ways they never imagined? As the meal came to an end, Eric stood and walked toward the door. I'll be back in a little while, he said, his voice soft but firm. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Lyra didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, she spoke. Thank you. I didn't expect kindness. Eric gave a small nod before leaving the shelter, his thoughts heavy. He had made a choice to help them, and now there was no turning back. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about providing shelter. It was about something more, something bigger than either of them. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the shelter there was a strange warmth. It wasn't just the food that filled the room, but something deeper, something Eric couldn't quite understand yet. But he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Eric came and went, offering food, supplies, and the occasional conversation. Lyra continued to cook and clean, her movements growing steadier with each passing day. But beneath the surface, the tension between them grew. Lyra's pride was a constant barrier, and Eric couldn't help but feel it. She wasn't used to being dependent on anyone, especially a human. One afternoon, as Eric sat on the porch of the shelter, his mind drifting, Lyra appeared at the door. Her face was set in that familiar expression of determination, but there was something different in her eyes, a spark that Eric couldn't quite place. "I need to help," Lyra said, her voice steady but edged with an undercurrent of frustration. "I can't just sit here while you do everything. I'm not helpless." Eric stood up slowly, wary of the force in her words. "Lyra, you're still recovering. You don't have to—" "I know my limits," she interrupted, her gaze fierce. "I can do more than this. You've given me food, shelter, kindness, but I won't just stay here doing nothing." Eric was quiet for a moment, considering her words. He had watched her closely these past few days, seen how hard she worked, even when it was clear that her body was still fragile from the long journey. He understood her need to feel useful. It wasn't just about survival. It was about pride, about maintaining some semblance of control over her life. "You don't have to do everything," Eric said, trying to calm her. "I'm here to help you too." Lyra's eyes softened, but only slightly. "I know, but I can't just hide away. I have to contribute." She stepped toward him, her movements purposeful. There was a fire in her now, an energy that had been missing when they first met. But there was also a weariness, a clear struggle between her pride and the reality of her situation. Eric hesitated, not sure how to proceed. "All right," he said finally. "But you need to promise me you'll rest when you can. You're not ready to go back out there and fight just yet." Lyra gave him a sharp look, but then nodded. "I will, but I need to do something. Let me help with the repairs on the shelter." Eric sighed, knowing he couldn't win this argument. Lyra was stubborn, and when she made up her mind, there was no changing it. He walked with her outside, where the shelter was beginning to show signs of wear. The storm seasons were coming, and they needed to reinforce the walls. Together, they worked, Lyra handling the smaller tasks, while Eric took on the heavier work. At first, their movements were awkward, a mix of his experience and her raw determination. But as the hours passed, they found a rhythm, and for the first time, there was a quiet understanding between them. "Do you miss it?" Eric asked, breaking the silence. He had been wondering this for a while. The war, the battles. Lyra didn't look at him as she worked, but her voice was steady. "I miss my people. I miss the honor of being part of something bigger than myself. But the war, no, I don't miss it." There was something in her voice, a rawness that Eric hadn't expected. It wasn't just the loss of her world that haunted her. It was the loss of everything she had once believed in. The pride of her people, the purpose of their battles. Now, all of that was gone, and in its place, there was nothing but survival. "I can't imagine what it's like," Eric said softly. "To lose everything." Lyra paused, her gaze flicking to him for a moment before returning to her work. "You don't need to imagine it," she said quietly. "You've seen it. You've fought for your life. But you still have a world to go back to. A future. I don't have that." Eric swallowed, the weight of her words settling over him. He had seen his own world change, seen people he cared about die. But Lyra was right. He still had something to go back to. She had nothing. Her people were scattered across the stars, lost to the chaos of the war. And here she was, in a place that wasn't her own, relying on a human to survive. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She just kept working, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But there was a shift in her. The walls she had built around herself, the armor she had worn, were beginning to crack. After a while, they finished their work. The shelter was reinforced, a little safer against the coming storms. Lyra stood back, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. There was satisfaction in her eyes, but also something else, a sadness that Eric couldn't ignore. "We did good work," she said quietly. Eric nodded. "Yes, we did." As they walked back into the shelter, the air was thick with unspoken words. Eric couldn't deny the growing sense of respect he felt for Lyra. She wasn't just a refugee. She wasn't just someone who had lost everything. She was strong. She had survived when so many others would have fallen. Later that evening, as the two of them sat together, the quiet of the shelter settled in around them. Zira had fallen asleep, curled up on one of the small beds, her soft breathing the only sound in the room. Lyra sat at the table, her eyes distant as she stared at the small fire crackling in the corner. "You're not just a refugee, are you?" Eric said softly, breaking the silence. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. "No," she replied after a long pause. "I'm more than that, but it doesn't matter anymore. I'm just trying to survive." Eric nodded. He understood that more than she realized. "We all are," he said quietly, and for a moment in that small, quiet shelter, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Both were survivors, in their own ways, and though their paths had crossed under strange circumstances, they would walk forward together. The days blurred together in a quiet routine. Lyra and Zira adapted to life in the shelter, and though Eric still maintained his distance, he couldn't help but notice how much they had come to mean to him. There was something about them. About Lyra's strength, Zira's innocence, that drew him in, despite the barriers of pride and suspicion that had kept them apart at first. But despite their calm exterior, Eric knew the truth. The war that had destroyed Lyra's people, that had torn apart her world, still haunted her. It was in the way she looked at the horizon sometimes, as if searching for something she couldn't reach. It was in the quiet moments when she seemed lost, even though she tried to hide it. Eric could see the cracks in her armor, the cracks she refused to let anyone else see. One evening, after another long day of work, Eric found himself sitting alone outside, staring at the stars. The cold wind swept across the barren landscape, but Eric didn't feel it. He was lost in thought, replaying everything that had happened since Lyra and Zira had come into his life. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Lyra was standing there, her silhouette outlined by the dim light from the shelter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy, filled with all the things they hadn't said to each other. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "You've been looking at the stars a lot lately. Thinking about something?" Eric turned his head slightly, not fully facing her. "Just thinking about everything. About what comes next?" Lyra nodded, though she didn't say anything right away. She stepped closer, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. For a moment, they just sat there, looking out at the vast emptiness of space. It was strange, Eric thought. Here they were, on a planet far from civilization, with nothing but the stars to remind them of the worlds that had been lost. Do you think they'll come for us?" Lyra asked, her voice small, vulnerable in a way Eric had never heard before. Eric frowned, surprised by the question. He had known that Lyra was waiting for her people to return, hoping that somehow someone from her world would come to save them. But he had never asked her what that really meant. What did it mean to wait for a future that might never come? "I don't know," Eric said slowly. "I wish I could promise you they will, but I don't know anything about your people. I don't know how long it will take, or if anyone is even left." Lyra's gaze dropped to the ground, her hands tightly gripping the edge of her coat. She wasn't looking for sympathy, Eric knew that. But there was something in the way she spoke that revealed a deep sadness. It was as if, in that moment, she was facing the reality that her world, her people, might truly be gone. And with it, any hope for the future. "My daughter is sick," Lyra said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric turned to her, startled. "What? Sick? How long has she—" Lyra raised a hand, stopping him before he could finish. "It's not just a cold or some kind of minor illness. Zira's condition is more complicated than that." She looked up at him, her eyes full of sorrow. "I thought it would get better, but it's getting worse." Eric's heart sank. Zira had always been quiet, reserved, but he had never seen anything in her that suggested something was wrong. He had assumed she was adjusting to life on the colony, just like her mother. But now the weight of Lyra's words settled heavily on him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she was struggling to find the right words. "Her body, it can't process the atmosphere here. She's from a different world, and I thought the transition would be easier, but—" Lyra's voice cracked. "She's getting weaker, Eric, and I don't know how to fix it." Eric was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. He had seen people suffer before, but this was different. This was a little girl who had no future unless something changed. And Lyra, strong, proud, and fierce Lyra, was helpless. "You should have told me sooner," Eric said, his voice firm with concern. "We could have done something. I have supplies. There has to be something I can do." Lyra shook her head. "I didn't want to burden you with it. You've already done so much for us. I wasn't sure if I should even tell you, but now I don't have a choice. If something doesn't change, I don't think she'll survive." Eric felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He didn't know what to say. He had helped them, given them shelter, food, and safety. But this was beyond anything he could solve on his own. He was just a soldier, not a doctor. And whatever Zira needed, whatever help she needed, he didn't know if he could provide it. "Is there anyone who can help her?" Eric asked, though he knew it was a long shot. "Anyone from your world who might have the knowledge, the medicine?" Lyra's eyes grew distant, her voice barely audible. "There's no one left. My people are scattered. Some are dead. The rest are out there somewhere, but I don't know where." Eric's heart clenched in his chest. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to help this family. He had only just started to learn what it meant to care for them, and now it seemed like time was running out. "I'll try," Eric said, his voice steady despite the fear rising in him. "I'll do everything I can to help her, Lyra. I promise." For the first time since their arrival, Lyra's eyes softened. She reached out, touching his arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I don't want you to make promises you can't keep. I just wanted you to know the truth." Eric nodded. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future held. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let them face this alone. As the night grew colder, the two of them sat in silence, their thoughts heavy with the weight of what had been said. The stars overhead seemed so distant, as if even the universe was indifferent to their struggles. But in that moment, Eric realized that the real fight wasn't against an enemy, a war, or even survival. It was against the deep, aching fear of losing what they had left. The following days passed with a heavy air of urgency. Eric had promised Lyra that he would help her daughter, Zira. But as the hours wore on, he found himself running out of ideas. He searched the nearby human settlements for any medical supplies, or specialists that could help, but nothing seemed to offer the answers he needed. The reality of Zira's condition weighed heavily on him. Every time he saw the look in Lyra's eyes, it reminded him of how helpless he felt. Lyra, on the other hand, had thrown herself into the daily routines of the shelter. She tried to focus on tasks, even though she knew Zira's illness was worsening. Eric saw how she held it together on the outside, but he could also see the cracks. She was breaking, slowly and quietly. She didn't want to admit it, but her daughter's survival was slipping through her fingers. One evening, after returning from another failed search for help, Eric found Lyra sitting beside Zira's bed. Her head was bowed, her hand gently brushing through Zira's dark hair. The little girl was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face pale. Lyra's usual strength was gone, replaced by an exhaustion that Eric couldn't ignore. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before stepping inside. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Lyra didn't look up. "You came back empty-handed, didn't you?" Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath the surface. She already knew the answer. "I knew there was nothing more you could do." Eric felt a pang of guilt, though he couldn't understand why he felt so responsible. It wasn't his fault that her people were scattered, that their medical knowledge was lost, or that he hadn't found a solution. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of her heartbreak, unable to offer the comfort she needed. "I'm sorry," Eric said, stepping closer. "I really thought there would be someone who could help." Lyra finally looked up at him, her eyes full of silent pain. "It's not your fault, Eric. I've been preparing myself for this, even though I didn't want to believe it. But I was wrong. I don't know what else to do." Eric moved to her side, kneeling down beside her. He didn't know what to say, but he knew that he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He reached out, gently placing his hand on hers, offering the only comfort he could. "I'm not giving up," Eric said, his voice firm. "We'll figure something out. I won't stop until I do. I promise." Lyra looked at him, and for the first time in days, a flicker of hope seemed to stir in her eyes. She didn't speak for a long time, as if considering his words carefully. Finally, she nodded. "I don't want to lose her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't lose her." The rawness in her voice shook Eric to his core. He had seen people fight for their lives, but he had never seen a mother fight this hard, this desperately. Lyra's pride and strength, which had once been her shield, now felt fragile, like a mask she couldn't keep up much longer. "I know," Eric said quietly. "I know." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound being Zira's soft breathing. It was a peaceful moment, a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, but also one that held an underlying tension. They both knew that time was running out. The next morning, Eric woke up early. He had decided that he wouldn't give up, not yet, not while there was still a chance. The human colony was small, but it was connected to a larger network of outposts. Maybe there was someone out there who could help. Maybe there was still hope. Lyra was awake when he came in to check on her. She was standing near the window, looking out at the barren landscape beyond the shelter. Her expression was distant, as if she was searching for something in the horizon. "I'm going to find someone," Eric said, his voice firm. "There has to be a way. I'm going to keep looking until we find a solution." Lyra didn't turn around at first, but then she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I know you will," she said quietly. "But I need you to know something. Eric." Eric paused, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" Lyra finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "If you can't find anyone, if she doesn't get better, I need you to promise me one thing." Eric's heart skipped a beat. "Anything." Lyra's voice cracked as she spoke. "Promise me you'll take care of her. If something happens to me, I don't want her to be alone." Eric was taken aback by her words. He had never thought about what would happen if things didn't work out. The idea of losing them both was something he hadn't allowed himself to entertain. But now, with the weight of Lyra's request hanging in the air, He realized just how real the danger was. "I promise," Eric said, his voice steady, though his heart ached with the weight of the promise. "I won't let anything happen to her." Lyra nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Eric didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and left the shelter, making his way toward the nearest communications station. He had one goal in mind now: to find help. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Zira or Lyra, not after everything they had been through together. As the hours passed, Eric's determination only grew. He contacted every outpost he could reach, speaking to every medic and technician who might have the knowledge to help Zira. But no one had the answer. Time was slipping away, and the weight of his failure pressed down on him. Just as Eric was about to give up, a signal came through. A message from an unknown source offering a possible solution. The transmission was weak, but the words were clear. "We have the technology. We can help her. Bring her to us." Hope. For the first time in days, Eric felt a spark of it. He quickly made arrangements, gathering everything he could for the journey. When he returned to the shelter, he found Lyra sitting beside Zira's bed, her hand resting gently on the girl's forehead. "We have a chance," Eric said, his voice filled with urgency. "There's a place that can help her. We're going to get her there." Lyra's eyes widened in disbelief. "You found someone?" "I did," Eric confirmed. "We're leaving as soon as possible." Lyra stood up, her strength returning with the news. She took a deep breath, looking down at Zira with a renewed sense of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. "We're not done yet," Eric replied, offering her a small smile. "We'll do this together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra allowed herself to believe in that possibility. The journey to the distant outpost felt like the longest Eric had ever undertaken. Days of travel through harsh terrain, with only the company of Lyra and Zira, had given him little time to think. But his mind was constantly racing, always coming, back to the same thought. Would they make it in time? Would Zira be saved? Or would they lose everything they had fought for? Lyra was more determined than ever. Her pride, which had always kept her at a distance, had transformed into something else entirely. She had become a mother, fully invested in the future of her daughter. The fierce warrior who had first arrived at the colony had been replaced by a woman who would do anything for her child. Zira, too, was quieter now. The illness had drained her energy, leaving her weaker with each passing day. She slept for long hours, only waking occasionally to look up at Eric or her mother with a weak smile. Her once lively eyes had dimmed, and Eric could see the toll. It was taking on both her and Lyra. They were in this together, but it felt like the clock was ticking, and no one knew how much time they had left. They finally reached the medical facility after several days of travel. It wasn't much, a small, remote research station on the outskirts of the galaxy, but it had the technology they needed. The place was simple, its sterile halls contrasting with the dust and desolation of the world outside. The scientists who worked there had been briefed on Zira's condition, and they were ready to assist. As soon as they arrived, a team of doctors and technicians took over. Lyra, who had been silent throughout most of the journey, now stood beside Zira's bed, her hands gripping her daughter's as the doctors worked to stabilize her. Eric remained in the background, watching, his heart tight with worry. He had done everything he could to get them here, but now the outcome was out of his hands. Lyra turned to Eric, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought we would make it this far." Eric gave a small nod, though his throat felt tight. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad we're here. That's all that matters now." Hours passed in tense silence, as the medical team worked to figure out how to help Zira. The small room felt far too quiet, the hum of medical machines the only sound breaking the stillness. Lyra's eyes never left her daughter, even as exhaustion began to take its toll. Eric knew how much she was holding inside, how much she had been forced to bear. Finally, a doctor approached Eric. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and kind eyes. "We've managed to stabilize her," the doctor said softly. "But there's more we need to do. Zira's condition is rare. Her body is struggling to adapt to the environment here. We have the technology to help, but it will take time." Lyra's gaze flickered to Eric, her worry etched on her face. "How long?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, then replied, "It could take days, maybe weeks. We'll need to run a series of treatments and monitor her progress. But the good news is she's responding to the initial treatment." Eric felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had a chance. There was hope now. Lyra, who had seemed like a rock, visibly relaxed. Her shoulders eased and she let out a quiet breath as if some weight had been lifted from her. "I will stay with her," Lyra said, her voice steady but with a quiet determination. "I'm not leaving her side." Eric nodded. He understood completely. "I'll check in with the team and see how things are going," he said, though his mind was still racing with worry. "But I'll be here, I promise." He left them to their private moment, walking out into the hall where a small group of doctors was gathered. He needed to be useful, to do something, anything, other than just wait. For hours, Eric worked alongside the medical staff, checking on the latest advancements and offering whatever help he could. His mind kept drifting back to Lyra and Zira. He knew how much this meant to her. He knew how desperately Lyra had fought to hold on to her pride, and how she had come to rely on him in the most vulnerable moments of her life. It had changed him, too. There was no denying that. As night fell, Eric returned to the small room where Lyra and Zira were being kept. He opened the door softly, trying not to disturb the quiet peace that had settled in. Lyra was still sitting beside Zira's bed, her hand resting on her daughter's, her eyes closed in quiet exhaustion. "How is she?" Eric asked softly, stepping inside. Lyra's eyes opened, and for the first time in a long while, there was a look of relief in them. "Better," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's breathing easier. They're making progress." Eric smiled, relieved to hear the good news. "That's great." Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. I never thought I could feel like this again. I thought I was beyond hope. But you gave me something I didn't think I had. Hope. For her. For both of us." Eric didn't know how to respond. He hadn't done it for thanks. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because in some strange way, he had come to care about them. He had come to care about her. "Sometimes hope is all we have left," Eric said quietly, "and sometimes it's enough." Lyra's gaze held his, a quiet understanding passing between them. She didn't need to say anything more. They both understood the depth of what had happened, the journey they had taken, the bond they had formed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, about finding meaning in the chaos of the universe. As the days passed, Zira's condition continued to improve. The treatments worked, slowly but surely. The doctors were optimistic. And for the first time since they had arrived, Eric saw a future where Lyra and Zira could live again, a future where they could find peace and safety. When Zira finally woke up, her eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was her mother. A weak smile spread across her face, and Lyra held her hand tighter, her voice full of emotion. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. tears slipping down her face. Eric watched from the doorway, the weight of everything they had been through still lingering in the air. But there was hope now. Hope that Zira would recover. Hope that Lyra's strength would continue to carry them forward. And for the first time in a long while, Eric believed that they had a future.